Before picking up from the last video, I need to run some history past you. In the year 1967, the world of organized crime had been hit by a devastating article, but this article was years in the making. Time magazine had set the standard in 1949 with the front-page cover of Frank Costello. Organized crime had come a long way since the days of bootlegging. They took over major industries in the 30s, and they built an empire that became a banking cartel in the 1940s, and when the 1940s was drawing to a close, Time magazine put Costello on the front page. That would lead to the Kefauver hearing. A groundbreaking hearing, but no action was followed up. Why? Because a new empire was on the rise. It was now the rise of the American empire after the death of the European empires such as the British, French, Italian and others. Organized crime was now going to play a part in helping this empire rise. America now started to fill that hole. Another nemesis was the Soviet Union, who after the war controlled almost half of Europe. Churchill had been defeated in his election in the UK. That loss came after the war in Europe had been won. The people, especially the working class, started to unite. The new government in Britain was a socialist one which enacted free healthcare, free housing, and free education. That election loss for Churchill stunned the global powers around the world, especially the new giant America. Then, during the late 1940s, the Nuremberg trials occur, laying out the evil of the Nazi Empire. The Holocaust stunned the Jewish community around the world. They never knew it was that bad. Maya. The Jewish Don Lansky was watching all that unfold. The late 40s and 50s, this man's power could not be messed with. He snapped his fingers and men snapped your neck. He was dangerous and ruthless. He got his hands dirty in the early days. The guy was short, but that did not mean he was not up for a fight. In the late 40s, Maya and the Jewish Mafia watched in shock at the Nuremberg trials which were being shown around the world. It highlighted the Nazi concentration camps. Maya was the Mafia's banker, a powerful position to be in, as the world of banking and organized crime started to collide. In the 50s, Britain was turning into a banking cartel. The year was 1951. Luciano had just booked himself into a hotel. He was waiting for another guest who would soon be joining him. He booked himself into this hotel under the name Salvatore Luciano. He would wear a grey suit, a hat and glasses. The hotel was called the White House near Hyde Park, London. The New York Mafia had finally done the unthinkable. They had gone international. The world was changing. The Mafia were now a powerful organization. Luciano would die in the year of 1962. His dead body would be paraded through New York. The mobsters would have a painful insight into what happens if they are deported. Like Luciano, they felt their own men would betray them, and they would die broke. Gambino and Marcello were at war with Kennedy, and both men knew the threat of deportation loomed over them. These men had built empires, generating a staggering amount of money. $2 billion was being generated a year out of the state of Louisiana, $6 billion a year from Havana, Cuba, $9 to $10 billion from New York. Vegas was now a huge earner. Land in the Vegas desert had been brought for next to nothing and was now starting to be worth a fortune. That land now sits on value worth billions. These men owned all the gambling, unions, industries, entertainment, the movie industry, and more, including narcotics. Lots of markets were being opened, especially in Europe, with countries looking for investment after the end of the Second World War. Mobsters poured in and started moving into narcotics more. It was starting to become huge. That money being generated by these mafia men would be laundered through the newly forming big banks. The number of money and industries these men engaged in was insane, and the new emerging industries, in the 50s we know they owned J. Edgar Hoover himself. They had a simple relationship with Hoover. The stories are wild and differ. Some say they had dirt on him, such as pictures and videos or moving pictures, as they were called in the old days. However, that type of dirt would have been useful to use against the FBI when the agents would eventually come after the Mafia in the late 70s and 80s. That evidence would have been an ace in the hole to completely back the agents off. Those pictures do not exist in my view. They did not need pictures. People speculate if J. Edgar Hoover knew about the Mafia, and if he did, to what extent. It goes a bit deeper than that. Hoover used organized crime to help better and further himself. When Bonnie and Clyde tore through the South killing scores of officers, they would be stopped not by the FBI but by 2 Texas Rangers and some local sheriffs. This went on to humiliate the newly formed FBI. So, Hoover from then on built a respectable friendship with Costello and the likes. If any hoodlum grows to big or grows to famous or powerful, and if he or she kills ordinary people and officers of the law, they were to be handed over to the FBI. If the Mafia did not comply, Hoover then threatened to light a fire on all their operations. So the likes of Lepke would be handed over to the FBI by the mob. Hoover personally showed up to make that arrest and take pictures, something he always wanted. Hoover was not money hungry, but fame and glory hungry. Many mobsters or threats to the mob or Hoover would either be framed or handed over to the FBI. Not just mobsters and gangsters, but political activists, left-leaning political figures and socialists, anyone who Hoover considered a threat. The mob helped Hoover control politics, and Hoover helped the mob control the streets. Hoover also took front-row seats to most high-profile boxing matches. He would collect the tickets from Costello a week prior himself. Hoover also asked Costello to rig dog races and horse races for him. So Hoover could then make light bets, but win big. That was Hoover's green envelope. That relationship would end after 1957 when Costello was shot, and then it died indefinitely in 1963 after the Valachi hearings. I shall detail the report, which details the amount of corruption, illegal spying, and racism within the FBI. Hoover was a gay, and his reign as the head of the FBI was a shocking one. He made a deal with Frank Costello in the 40s. They had meetings in a private park in New York. Hoover dined at the same restaurants, attended the same racetracks as these men, and the same casinos, the same functions and gatherings. He denied organized crime existed since the 40s and 50s, as well as the 60s. The 50s were testing times for the New York Mafia. The organized crime structure in America had grown to be a serious criminal syndicate. Coming into the 50s, these men were working with the CIA, FBI, and British intelligence, as well as a lot more. Fast forward to 1966, and Carlos Marcello, boss of Louisiana and the Gulf states, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, Agnello della Croce, as well as the boss of bosses of New York, Carlo Gambino, and the boss of Florida, Santo Trafficante, as well as the other mob royalty, were about to enjoy a nice meal after a productive meeting, discussing the future of businesses that would be conducted in regards to New York and Louisiana. Before they even got served their drinks, they were followed into the restaurant by 2 police officers who told them to remain seated. The officers quickly grabbed a piece of paper and pen and made a note of the seating arrangement of where the mob bosses were sat, and next to who. That seating arrangement showed the closeness of these families spread throughout the United States. The Marcello crime family and the Gambino family with the Lucchese crime family shared a lucrative narcotics empire, as well as corruption, bribery, and extortion on some of America's biggest companies. The Colombo crime family had white-collar crime interests with Marcello, such as fraud, real estate, stock manipulation, tax fraud, and frauds that made them hundreds of millions. This connection with the New York higher-ups started in the mid-1930s, when Costello started introducing Marcello around all the circles as the gambling czar down south. Marcello ran a tight ship. He would have meetings with higher-ups in the mob. He would fly out by private plane or have them fly to him. They would land on a private strip owned by him, and he would meet whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. The year was 1951. 2 hearings were happening. The Kefauver and the McCarthy hearings both threw shocking allegations into the public's face. Robert F. Kennedy was on the McCarthy hearings. The hearings he was part of would go down in history as a sham. It got so bad with Robert, Senator McCarthy, who knew his hearings were a sham, phoned Robert's dad to have him removed. He said his son was too mad. These hearings ruined Robert's legacy. He was known as one of the men who tried to ruin innocent people's lives based on lies. So, when 1957 came around, Robert finally had sunk his teeth into something. He went all the way back to Abe Reles, the canary who could not fly. He went all the way back to Maranzano and Masseria. Luciano was in Sicily, watching these men get ripped apart in the years of 1958 through 1959. He enjoyed seeing Vito get ripped by Robert. He enjoyed it when some more of his enemies were called up and grilled. He was stunned when he saw Marcello there. Robert did not hold back. He did his research. RFK went to the mobster's hometown himself to do some digging. He sent his men there to ask questions. Frank Costello was questioned. Frank Costello could have ended RFK at any time. Costello could have told him about his partners but chose not to. One of those partners was Robert's dad, Frank could have snitched. The code of omerta, however, forbid it. Omerta meant omerta, even when dealing with your enemies. RFK did this to all the mobsters. He made threats to most of them. Marcello was threatened with deportation, so was Bufalino. Accardo had to explain himself. Meyer tried to run like he did in 1951. RFK waited him out. He then eventually grilled Meyer. Giancana was ripped. RFK was creating his new history. All of this was broadcasted. Luciano would pass away in the year of 1962, so, when Luciano's body was paraded through New York, it sent a message to Marcello and Gambino, and a year after Valachi came forward to rat out Luciano's entire empire, certain mobsters like Marcello, Giancana, and Bufalino knew what this was. They had to do something, or they could be the next Luciano. The Kennedy assassination occurred in 1963. The war on organized comes to a complete stop. Now, continuing from our last video, in the first part of the 1967 Life magazine, does a hit on the entire mafia structure. New York to Chicago to New Jersey, all the families were mentioned. Over 25 families were caught up in the scandal. That scandal was the skimming of casinos, millions stolen, the corruption and the murder. It called the American Mafia, the biggest criminal syndicate in the world, generating billions and rigging elections. This magazine was a shot at Carlos Marcello. The magazine knew he was a different breed of mafia, so they hit him on the final page. They teased him to see what he would do. The magazine knew Marcello could move autonomously. He did not need to get the permission of the National Commission. So they knew to move with caution. They threw the allegation at both Carlos Marcello and Jimmy Hoffa. They state Hoffa had tasked Marcello with getting him out of jail. After all, Nixon was in his pocket. Johnson was also, but he was useless. Frank Ragano was a lawyer with 3 powerful contacts. He worked for Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello and Hoffa. Jimmy had a snitch in his camp tape recording everything that was going on. That snitch was Ed Partin, a Teamster official from Louisiana. Hoffa knew Ragano and could vouch for him. Hoffa did not know Ed Partin, but assumed he was connected to Carlos Marcello because he was from the same state. That was a big mistake Hoffa made. Ed Partin was from Louisiana, but Marcello was too rich to care about every union in his state. He left some alone. Marcello did not know or never had heard of Ed Partin. But Ed Partin had heard of Carlos Marcello. That was Hoffa's flaw. He had a big mouth. The Mafia hated that about him. Ragano did pass the message on to Marcello. Carlos looked back at him with an expression of shock and pure anger. Ragano knew he said something he should not have. Santo would later tell Ragano never to mention such a thing again. In '63, when JFK was eventually hit, Ragano showed no remorse. He celebrated the death of JFK with Santo. Then, in the year of 1966, a year before this magazine comes out, the meeting between Carlos Marcello, Carlo Gambino, Aniello Della Croce, the heads of the Gambino family, Tommy Eboli. Eboli and his brother Pat were the ones delivering messages to Luciano in Italy. Mike Miranda, a higher-up in the Genovese family. Joe Colombo, head of the Colombo family. Joseph Marcello and Anthony Corolla, higher-ups in the Louisiana Mafia. Santo Trafficante Jr., boss of Florida. Dominic Alonghi, a secretive capo in the Genovese family. Frank Galliano, underbosses for Carlos Marcello. FBI reports state days before the assassination he was seen with Oswald, handing him an envelope filled with cash under the table. These men who denied being in organized crime or knowing each other were now arrested in New York at the La Stella restaurant. Carlos was there to help Gambino appoint a new boss of the Lucchese family. Gambino would return the favor by ensuring all the Genovese higher-ups with Colombo and Lucchese would back Carlos Marcello to remain the boss of bosses of Louisiana, as the original head of the family had returned from deportation and wanted his position back. All these men would be arrested. It was major news. I have some of the footage of them being paraded into questioning. Marcello returned to New Orleans airport to a huge fanfare welcome. He was front-page news. Louisiana loved gangsters and had a rich history of them. They always wondered if there ever was a mafia in Louisiana. The Italian community knew obviously there was one, and it was the oldest one around. When Marcello returned from his trip in New York, he returned to a fanfare welcome back at the airport in New Orleans. Waiting for him is a young FBI agent who had been pestering Marcello for some time. The young agent yells at Marcello and an argument ensues, and Carlos punches the FBI agent in the face twice. Carlos Marcello's brother Joe is stunned. He bear hugs Marcello and wrestles his brother out of the airport, before handcuffs could be put on him. Now Carlos had turned a small news story into breaking headlines. He was all over the papers as a mafia boss. The FBI agent who had been punched by Marcello was happy, however. His boss Hoffa was furious. After years of following and carrying out surveillance on Marcello, that agent was never able to convince the ordinary people of New Orleans that Marcello was the head of a mafia family. After his arrest with Joseph Colombo, Carlo Gambino and the likes, there was no denying it for Marcello. People were now talking about David Ferrie and Guy Bannister. Both of these men worked for Marcello. There were people questioning Oswald and his relationship with Ferrie and Bannister. People in Dallas were talking about Ruby and Ferrie and linking Oswald to them. After the Warren report drops and the dust starts to settle, witnesses start talking publicly about what happened and how their testimony had been changed by the Warren Commission. Marcello had to do something. He owned his state. Its entire infrastructure belonged to him. So he sends Garrison on a fishing expedition in 1966 after the famous La Stella meeting and after Marcello punches the agent in the face. This is when Garrison starts his investigation into the JFK assassination. He gets anonymous funding to start it and to keep it secret, which he did. His interviews were done in secret, till the newspapers find out. By then he already spoke to numerous witnesses who told him about the involvement of the underworld. They were all killed. Some made the news, one being David Ferrie, the others being numerous strippers and witnesses who spoke of Ruby's connection to the Mafia. Oswald's connection to David Ferrie was a huge concern for Marcello. It was Ferrie who handed Oswald to Marcello. Carlos was with Ferrie in court on the day of the assassination. Marcello killed all the witnesses Garrison had on his list. The sole aim of that investigation being remove all blame from organized crime and deflect the blame from Oswald by pointing out obvious flaws in the Warren report. That information could have only come from the likes of Marcello, who would have known about certain CIA operations like Operation Mongoose. Marcello would have been able to find out who said what to Garrison. When all the witnesses Garrison spoke to were being killed, Garrison got the message, which was, wrap it up, which he did. With enough mud in the water, Marcello knew it would be difficult for anyone to find out what happened in 1963. RFK and MLK would be killed while Garrison's inquiry was going public. The FBI agents and everyone else got the message. Back off the South. Marcello did not care about other groups being targeted, such as New York, Chicago, and others were fair game. But the Southern Mafia is overall on another level. Hoffa would stay well clear of Marcello from then on till his death. I get a lot of questions about the JFK movie. The answer is simple. The movie was about Jim Garrison and all lies. He worked for Carlos Marcello. Throughout the 60s, Garrison stated organized crime did not exist in New Orleans. He stated that throughout the 60s and 70s. After the assassination, he spoke to Ferrie immediately, then dropped the inquiry when he found out Ferrie was in court with Marcello on the day of the assassination. Then after the famous La Stella meeting, Marcello was breaking news. Garrison was also being investigated for corruption. He starts his inquiries, and his reason being there were inconsistencies in the Warren report. He was right. But why did he wait until 1966 to start his investigations? Hoffa was Robert's biggest conviction. Garrison would hound Ed Partin for testifying against Hoffa. Garrison chased him out of New Orleans. He was friends with Ragano, who also stated Garrison was doing the investigation for Marcello and fame. Garrison never spoke to Ruby. He was told not to. Then boom. After the threat to Marcello in 1967, Garrison goes after Life magazine with Marcello's money and muscle. Big mistake. The magazine was packing its own weapons. They went after the Don again with a massive story. Garrison was hit in 1970 as well. He now needed Marcello more than ever. He was exposed as a Marcello lapdog. Jim Garrison wanted to respond to Life magazine, so he appointed certain officials to investigate Marcello. Those investigators were in Marcello's pockets, and he knew it. Life magazine would expose them all. Garrison shut all the investigations down when they started to implicate Marcello. Garrison spoke to multiple witnesses who linked Oswald to organized crime. They were all killed. He spoke to Ferrie, and he slipped that information out to the newspapers. Marcello had Ferrie killed. Garrison was good friends with Marcello. He took campaign contributions from him and his contacts. Garrison attended the same fundraisers as Marcello. Garrison met and knew most of the Marcello family, especially Joe Marcello. Garrison was a known womanizer. He gambled at Marcello's gambling spots. He dined at his restaurants. Oliver Stone added so many lies to his movie it was insane. Most of the characters in the movie were known Marcello contacts. However, in the late 60s, when Garrison was doing that investigation into the JFK assassination, the first article comes out in 1967. This Life magazine article nailed Marcello. It spoke about his relationship with Hoffa and how he used Jim Garrison to hunt Ed Partin. It shows Marcello had $2 million to get Hoffa out of jail. The legal infrastructure of Louisiana hounded Partin so much, he ran out of Louisiana. Garrison was the attack dog of Carlos Marcello. Life magazine knew what they were going up against. The magazine was ready for all-out war. That was the last threat. In 1967, the magazine would come back for more. In 1970, Life magazine told the story of corruption, mafia, and gangsters, as well as the political class. This article did good damage. It made the FBI focus slowly back on organized crime. "The little man is bigger than ever," the headline read. A huge picture of Carlos Marcello walking out of court with his lawyer behind him, with his journalists lifting the wire so he didn't trip over. They must have heard about the punch that FBI agent got to his face when he upset Marcello, therefore made sure Marcello was not touched or harassed. The first paragraph stated, in 1967, when Life began a series of stories dealing with the grip of organized crime on the United States, we cited a classic example how one powerful mafia chieftain, Carlos Marcello, controlled the state of Louisiana. He did so with little interference from local public officials or police, and indeed, often with their help. Marcello literally was at war during the 60s, but at the end, at the start of the 70s, he was the dawn of Louisiana. Nothing and no one could touch him. He had used the political infrastructure around him to keep him secure. He was the definition of a don. His family and brothers ran the streets while he ran the boardrooms, and he was never seen in either of them, a boss of bosses behind closed doors. This man was not that famous. Ricardo and Chicago were way more attractive headlines, and New York and Gambino were way more famous headlines. The Louisiana Mafia, as well as Carlos Marcello, were never mentioned. The rest of America simply looked over the Midwestern and Southern areas. They focused on the famous states like California and New York and Chicago, not knowing the real Mafia was born in Louisiana. Life magazine had been pressured into making this article simply because they knew the Mafia boss of Louisiana did not take well to their hit piece in 1967. The 60s were testing time for Marcello. He was using Garrison for his own means. Suddenly, the Life magazine article now linked those powerful people straight back to these powerful members of organized crime. Garrison was not a patriot. He was owned by these types of men, and Life magazine would hit him. Robert Kennedy labeled Carlos Marcello one of the most dangerous mafiosi men in America. Garrison and the head of the FBI department in Louisiana labeled Carlos Marcello a tomato salesman. Garrison stated even in the 60s Marcello was a tomato salesman. He stated that in the 70s. In fact, in the 1978 HSCA hearings that was looking into the JFK assassination, Garrison stated that in front of Robert Blakey that all Carlos Marcello is a tomato salesman. The Don of Louisiana, even in the 70s, knew that the political infrastructure could not call him out for what he was. You could not get anywhere in politics, especially the South, by labeling Carlos Marcello a mafia boss. You could not get anywhere in politics by labeling Carlos Marcello a mafiosi. You cannot get anywhere in politics if you did not say there was no such thing as organized crime. Especially in the South and in Louisiana, you had to deny it all the time. That way, Carlos knew he could always trust you and hand you a pile of cash. Then, boom, 1970, this magazine comes out detailing his corruption, especially how he owns all the Louisiana infrastructure regarding certain positions in the government. It said Marcello had more made men and capos in places of government than any other mob boss in America. When that report came out in 1967, certain politicians like Senator John McKeithen approached the magazine and stated things like, "Thank you for pointing out all this corruption in our state, and we will do our best to clean it up." He also stated that we cannot wait to get back into Louisiana to start getting to work to make sure some of these men are sitting in the penitentiary. 2.5 years later, the Life magazine report gave an update regarding what he had done. The senator had gone back to New Orleans and pretty much done nothing. In fact, he just appointed some loyalists to him and his administration who were in Marcello's pocket already to investigate. Remarkably, they found nothing connecting Marcello to the Mafia. It spoke about 5 certain individuals, and the 6th one was Jim Garrison. It spoke about Jimmy Davis, who was an elected official in 1944 till 1948, as well as 1960 till 1964. He was Marcello-backed. Gambling and vice flourished and expanded in Louisiana. Davis, who had Marcello financial backing, was preparing to run again in 1972. Another man was Ashton Moulton, who had consistently squashed investigations into non-payment of state tax by Carlos Marcello. Then there was Revenue Department Attorney Emmett Batson, who failed to prosecute anybody for income tax evasion and didn't file a tax return for himself from 1965 to 1968. Leon Gary, who had the same Marcello contacts at the Sands Casino. He was a state legislator. He was also crucial in getting state highway departments to give Marcello certain contracts. Certain state investigators traced Marcello phone calls to the capital office of C.H. Sammy Downs. The New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison conducted a grand jury, hearing which found no organized crime in New Orleans. Those men, as I mentioned before, were appointed by Garrison and Senator John McKeithen. Jim Garrison was reselected in 1969. He stated if organized crime was ever discovered in New Orleans, Louisiana, he would personally resign. When it was discovered by Robert F. Kennedy, Kefauver hearings, McLennan hearings, the Valachi hearings, Jim Garrison did nothing. My final point is this: it is well known district attorneys were in the pocket of the Mafia. If a mob boss cannot purchase his district attorney, then he cannot purchase anything. He's practically useless. Marcello had multiple district attorneys in his back pocket. This is the end of part 1.